Today we're going to talk about alternate payment models. This was a presentation I put together as a lunch and learn, and I wanted to incorporate something fun, so I picked Ted Lasso. Hopefully you think he's fun too. But I really want you to take what you learned from Dr. Phil and think about it as we talk about alternate payment models, because I think this really brings to life pharmacoeconomics in a real world example. The learning objectives for today are you'll be able to identify some alternate payment models, what they are, types. You will be able to talk about the best price rule and its impact on value-based contracting, and then discuss a few outcomes measures that are currently being used. Hopefully you remember that you learned about formularies, and formularies have different tiers, and there's a tier that will have preferred drugs. And the reason that those drugs are placed on the tiers are they are, more, they're best economics, they're the best drugs in terms of outcomes, and those drugs are on a preferred tier, which means they have fewer restrictions like step edits, and those types of things. So they're easier for the doctor to prescribe, and they incentivize the doctor to prescribe those preferred drugs. And then those preferred tiers have lower copays or lower coinsurance for the members to incentivize those members to take them. So some of the drugs that end up on the preferred tiers, manufacturers have offered the payers and PBMs rebates to be preferred over the competitor drugs. And that's why you have step edits sometimes where you have to step through, that preferred drug to get to a competing drug. And so those rebates, the more drugs you dispense of those preferred drugs, the more rebates you get. So those rebates are based on, volume. Alternate payment models are based on value. And so we're trying to tie the price of the net cost of the drug to the value that that drug delivers. Different types of alternate payment models, the different names for them are value-based contracts, value-based arrangements, outcomes-based contracts, innovative contracting. They're all basically the same thing. And again, it's where reimbursement is tied to the performance of the drug. So there are different types of alternate payment models or value-based contracts. You can have financial risk-based contracts that can be, you could put a price cap on something. You could do a per member, per month, total cost of care. And then there's a mortgage model. This is used, we're going to talk about gene therapies. And so they've talked about doing a mortgage model on a gene therapy that's multi-million-dollar drug, and you don't want to pay for it all up front. So can you spread that cost over time? Indication specific pricing. So if you have, say you have an oncology treatment that treats 5 different types of cancer, but it performs better in one cancer over another. So you might be willing to pay more when it completely cures the cancer versus, another indication where it might not perform as high. And then health outcomes-based contracts. So for instance, lab values. If you have a drug that treats diabetes, you might tie the payment to how well it lowers A1C. You can also measure hospitalizations, disease progression, mortality. There's all types of things that you can tie payment to. Some lessons learned from value-based contracting. Value-based contracting should take a collaborative approach. So it needs to integrate with the overall rebate strategy. And what this means is that not every drug is a good candidate for value-based contracting. Insulin, for example. We know insulin works really well. We don't necessarily need to collect any real-world evidence around it. Insulin, some of the manufacturers recently lowered their prices, so you don't necessarily need to do like a PMPM on those. Insulin wouldn't really be a good candidate for value-based contracting. Those are good candidates for just straight formulary rebates. The most successful VBCs are a win-win for both the payer and pharma. Both sides are getting something out of the VBC. They should produce meaningful outcomes. So you really need to think about what you're trying to measure. You want it to be something that is important, not just something that you necessarily know that it's not or it will pay out on. VBC should provide value, and value doesn't always mean money. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't set up a VBC so it's always going to fail and always going to pay out money. Sometimes the value that comes from a value-based contract is the learning and the data that you end up with. And then you need buy-in from internal stakeholders and policymakers. And we're going to talk about the Medicaid Best Price rule and why that's important to VBCs. So how do we figure out which drugs we want to do a VBC, and how do we measure success for the payer and for the pharmaceutical manufacturer? So first of all, high-cost drugs are a perfect target for VBCs because we want to pay a reasonable value when the drug works, and we hope, our goal as a payer would be to pay nothing if it doesn't work. And pharma is able to collect data on drug performance, and they also can get product access. So that means they can get access to the formulary. A new mechanism of action, a new indication, new therapeutic class is a great target. A big reason for this is because when something new comes out, of course, they've done clinical trials. You have data from the clinical trials, but clinical trials are very well controlled, and it's on a very small population of people. We know that clinical trials are lacking minorities a lot of times, and pregnant women, children. So when this drug is launched, it will have a label for certain folks, but sometimes it gets used more broadly. And we need to understand how it is actually performing in the real world as opposed to that well-controlled clinical trial population. And so value-based contracts can be a good way to collect data on that in the real world. If you have a highly competitive drug class, that can be a great time to do a value-based contract. It can give you head-to-head information about all the drugs in the class. So take Humira and Enbrel. They're both TNFs. If you had a VBC, you could see which one performs better, because just because they're the same mechanism of action, sometimes they don't necessarily perform the same. Variable dosing or potential for wastage. If you have drugs, some drugs, especially rare disease drugs, they don't manufacture them in multiple vial sizes. And so if you have different patients of different weight, you'll have very high wastage in some cases. And so that doing a value-based contract, you can get predictability of costs on those types of occasions. So in 1990, the Medicaid drug rebate program was created by Congress. This is also referred to as the Medicaid Best Price rule. And what it is Medicaid, in order to cover the drug, demanded that manufacturers pay a rebate that's equal to the best price available to anyone in the market, or a certain percentage of the drug's average manufacturer price, whichever one is lower. So AMP is the average price paid by wholesalers, pharmacies purchasing directly from the manufacturer, not inclusive of discounts. Remember, we have WAC, we have ASP, we have AWP, and now we have AMP. The best price is the lowest price available from the manufacturer during the rebate period to any wholesaler, retailer, provider, HMO, nonprofit, or government entity within the United States. So the Congress originally set the minimum basic rebate, which is sometimes called a statutory rebate, at 12.5%. Then it changed over time, and finally the ACA raised the statutory rebate to 23.1% of AMP. So what that means is if you are a manufacturer and you launch a drug today and you want Medicaid to cover that drug, you automatically have to give them a discount of 23.1% of AMP off of your drug, unless you go out and negotiate a rebate for 27% to Blue Cross Blue Shield. Then that becomes the best price, and you have to give 27% to Medicaid. Now, the only exceptions are clotting factors and drugs that are only approved for pediatric indications exclusively. The minimum rebate is set at 17.1% for those. So AMP was capped originally at 25%. It was raised at 50 and then to 100. And you might ask, that's weird. Like, why would there ever be 100% discount in the market? Well, it's very complicated, but what can happen is that when a drug, let's use insulin, for example, has been out for a long time, they've taken a lot of price increases over time. They have high rebates in the market, and then they also have price protection rebates in the market. And when you do all these fancy calculations, it can get to the point where the discount that's owed could be over 100% to Medicaid. And so historically that had a cap on it. Now the American Rescue Plan of 2021 removed the AMP cap that was going to be effective this year. And in some cases, like insulin manufacturers, they were going to have to pay a rebate of greater than 100% to Medicaid, meaning they were literally paying Medicaid to use their drug. The way that they got around this is, you may have noticed about 6 months ago, longer now actually, about a year ago, insulin manufacturers said that they were going to lower their prices, some as much as 50%, decrease in WAC. It was a great feel-good news story. We're doing this for the patients because it's the right thing to do. Well, really, they were doing it so they didn't have to pay more than 100% to Medicaid, because it helped them get around this AMP cap. And so, they were able to spin it into a good feel-good news story, but that's really why they did it. So while Medicaid Best Price is great for Medicaid, it can be a barrier to value-based contracting. So value-based contracting, the intent is only to pay on failures. So I could go out and negotiate a value-based contract that says, okay, if it fails, you give me 100% back. I could have one person out of 100 that are taking the medication fail. They give me 100%. Well, what happens is that sets the Medicaid Best Price at 100%. And now all of a sudden, that manufacturer is having to pay 100% rebate on all Medicaid utilization just because one person failed on their drug. So, of course, they don't want to do that. They don't want to offer that because they don't want to take on that risk. And so that has really been a barrier to value-based contracting and a barrier for them negotiating anything above Medicaid Best Price. So when I was at Optum, we came up with an idea to do a value-based contract that covered an entire class. And we looked at the immunomodulator class, which is drugs like Humira, Enbrel, Taltz, Cosentyx, things that treat rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis and Crohn's. And we came up with a concept, and we were going to pitch it to all the manufacturers in the class, and it was going to result in a significant amount of savings to the healthcare system and patients themselves. And this is a white paper that we published as an example, and I'm going to talk through some of the details with you. This value-based contract or idea was, we were going to link the payment to whether a patient stays on the drug, switches to a different drug, or discontinues treatment. And that was called the response rate. Essentially, we were tying adherence and persistence as a proxy to the drug's clinical efficacy. And we were going to calculate the response rate for the entire class, and that's really the baseline. And so the rebate that the manufacturer pays is tied to the response rate of their drug. If their drug performed higher and had a better response rate, they paid a lower rebate. If their drug performed under the baseline response rate, they would have to pay a higher rebate. So we were tying the outcome to the value and net cost of their drug. For patients, normally these drugs sit on what's called the specialty tier, and the specialty tier is usually a co-insurance tier, so they're paying a % of the cost of the drug, which is a very high cost drug. We were going to move, we had put this on a new formulary that Optum was launching, and their preferred tier was $25. So we were going to move these drugs that participated to the preferred tier. So they were going to go from an average $248 out-of-pocket costs to $25, saving the patient $223. We were also going to put all of the drugs that participated on this tier with no restrictions in between the drugs. So sometimes you might have to doctors might have to prescribe a TNF before they can prescribe an IL-17. We were going to say you don't have to do that. Any of these drugs that are on this tier, you can try first. You can try an IL-17 before you try a TNF, if that's what you wanted to do. So we really felt like this was a win-win-win-win scenario. Payers, they were able to pay a fair price for the drug based on the efficacy. Manufacturers, their drug was going to go on the lowest branded tier and have open access. Providers, they were going to have a wider range of prescribing options, and then patients would have affordable access at the $25 tier. Now, what happened? We went out and the main feedback that we heard from manufacturers is that, hey, this is a great concept, it's a great idea, but we are concerned that this is going to affect our Medicaid best price. And nobody has signed up for this yet. And so if you had one client that signed up for it and you just have a small amount of failures, it's going to affect what we pay for Medicaid as a whole. There's a lot of risk. So we understood that. So we actually took that feedback. We published this white paper, and we also went to CMS and met with them and shared our concerns as well. And as a result, in December 2020, we talked to them. Wasn't the whole reason that they made this rule, but after we talked to them, this rule did come out in December 2020 to promote value-based contracts. So it has a very long name there, but essentially what it does is it allows, instead of just reporting one multiple best price, you can now report multiple best prices and a thing called bundle sales. Now, it's a very complicated rule change, but the idea is that it would allow you to carve out value-based contracts, and you can have a value-based contract with a commercial payer, and as long as you offer a value-based contract to Medicaid as well, that best price that's set by that value-based contract won't affect all Medicaid best price. There are some limitations. This thing called the anti-kickback statute, that is what protects rebates from being a kickback. Value-based contracts are not part of the anti-kickback statute right now, so they're not necessarily protected. So that would just be great for them to include that in that statute, just so that everyone, the lawyers, have more comfort level doing value-based contracts and knowing that they're in a safe harbor. There are ASP implications, and then there's also operational challenges around submitting multiple best prices. In our white paper, we mentioned $4.4 billion of potential savings to the health system that we calculated. I just shared this slide because this is American Diabetes Association article, and they estimate that if you used value-based contracts to reduce the burden of diabetes by as little as 5%, that could save $12 billion. So I just use this as another example that there's significant amount of spend that is out there in the healthcare system that we could reduce just by tying value to the payments and not just paying in a fee-for-service type way. These are some examples of real-world value-based contracts that have been out there and published in the news. Brilinta, which is a blood thinner for cardiac patients. There was a value-based contract that UPMC and Harvard Pilgrim did with AstraZeneca, and the payment was tied to a reduced incidence of hospitalization post-heart attack for patients that took Brilinta. There was also a Jardiance VBC that's been in the market for a while that's around total cost of care. Spark, they have a drug called Luxturna that's a gene therapy for the treatment of congenital vision loss. They have a value-based contract that's been in the market for quite some time. CAR-T, Kymriah and Yescarta are a couple CAR-T therapies that are very expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They have value-based contracts that they've put into the market for failure. Novartis launched Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, and they did offer an installment payment plan and a money-back guarantee for failure. This is an interesting VBC type arrangement that's in the market that's not actually with a payer or a PBM. This is a warranty program for Xalkori that Pfizer put out. Xalkori is an oncology medication. It's around $20,000 a year. And what they said is if the patient stops taking it within the first 3 months because the drug is, they're having bad side effects, it's not working, have progression, whatever, they will pay back the cost of the drug to whatever the patients paid out of pocket, and then pay the rest back that the plan and PBM has picked up on this medication. The catch is the physician and the patient are the ones that have to submit for the warranty, not the plan or the PBM. So the way the value-based contracts are traditionally done is the PBM and the plan, they negotiate them, they submit all the information to the manufacturer, and then they get the money back. So this is putting the onus on the provider and the patient. As you can imagine, it's not a great, with the patient who has cancer and is taking a medication that just failed, their first priority is not necessarily going to be submitting all of this paperwork to the manufacturer to get their money back. And it's very likely that they haven't paid anything at all for the drug. A lot of health plans have what's called chemo parity, which means that oral and other oncology medications are priced the same as chemo, which is usually $0. And so the patient may have not paid anything out of pocket for this drug. The provider is not going to go out of their way to submit paperwork so that the insurance company can get money back. I think everybody knows that providers usually have a contentious relationship with insurance companies. So they're not doing them any favors. So the chances of this warranty program actually ever being utilized are slim to none. So while it's great in theory, not great in execution. This is a slide about migraine VBC that we did at United Healthcare Optum, and we talked about it on a PCMA panel, so that's why I can talk about it here. In 2018, a new class of migraine medications were launched called CGRPs, and historically, the treatment for migraines, there's a lot of generic mechanism of action drugs out there that are very cheap that you can try. And so the cost to treat migraines was not very high other than Botox. But it's pretty difficult to get, you've got to fail a bunch of drugs before you can go try Botox to treat migraines. So when these CGRPs were going to be launched, they had really great clinical data associated with them, but they were launching at a relatively high cost compared to what was already out there to treat migraines. So there was concern from payers about adding these in, and what UHC said was, hey, we're willing to add these to formulary, but we want to be sure that there are going to be medical cost offsets that offset the additional cost of paying for this drug. So we came up with a VBC that accounts for total cost of care, including medical cost offsets, adherence, absenteeism, presenteeism, which is obviously we couldn't measure that, but we used a proxy. But this is the first. I think this is the first VBC that has ever taken that into account. And why is that important in migraines? Well, in migraines, it really affects your quality of life, and it affects your ability to be present at work, present in doing things with friends and family. And so by taking these drugs that reduce migraines or treat migraines faster, you're able to go to work and go hang out with your friends and all that kind of stuff. So we wanted to account for, quality of life in this. So we did it as a two-sided risk, which means that every quarter, every 6 months, we measured all of these things. And we have pretty complicated formulary, but we came up with formula. We came up with the price based on all of these things, and that was the price going forward for the next 6 months. And so it was a variable price, and the price could go up or down by a pretty significant margin based on this. And what we found was there were significant medical cost offsets to offset the price of this drug. This drug is effective. The CGRPs are effective and they work. And at the end of the day, we said, you know, we went to the 3 manufacturers that launched. We said, you can, if you want to participate in this, we'll give you formulary access. 2 of the 3 did. And for the 2 years that I was there doing the measurements, it was very successful, and all parties were very happy with this arrangement. Finally, let's talk about gene therapy VBC. So gene therapy, been talking about gene therapies for years. There were, you know, quite, like maybe 1, 2 would come out a year. Now gene therapies are really picking up speed, and over the past 2 years, there have been significant progress made in getting approvals from the FDA. So we have Roctavian, which is a gene therapy for hemophilia. It was launched at $2.9 million. Lyfgenia is for sickle cell at 3.1. We have one for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy that was then launched at 3.2 million. Hemgenix is another hemophilia for hemophilia B at 3.5 million. And then finally, Lenmeldy was just approved for juvenile metachromic leukodystrophy at 4.25 million. So you can see every time a gene therapy launches, it launches at a higher price. Part of this is because these are pretty small populations. So they put a lot of, you know, investment into these drugs and developing these drugs and doing clinical trials. And then very small populations are going to have access to them. And if you think about it, you know, think about all the people that have hemophilia A. Not everyone that has hemophilia A is going to go get Roctavian. So it's even a smaller subset of the population that is actually going to be eligible for and choose to take this gene therapy. That's part of the reason why they price them so high. So because these are priced very high, we definitely want to make sure that they're working. BioMarin put out a program for Roctavian where they are willing to cover the companion diagnostic testing that's required to make, you know, test folks for hemophilia A to see if they're eligible to take Roctavian. And they will pay a refund based on the offset costs of avoiding factors. So what that means is that the assumption is you take this gene therapy and then you won't have any bleeds, and so you won't have a need for factor. And so this medication should offset historical factor costs for that patient. And if it doesn't, then BioMarin has said that they will pay for the factors. They won't pay you back the 2.9 million that you paid for the drug, but they will pay you for these factor costs. Now, how long? Forever? No, probably not. Probably for like a year or 2. So at the end of the day, are you whole to your 2.9 million? Probably not. Bluebird Bio's outcome-based contract for their sickle cell disease treatment, they will, for 3 years, offer rebates if a patient is hospitalized with a crisis. So they aren't going to pay you back because that drug failed, the 3.1 million, but they will pay you the hospital cost if they have a crisis. So while these are better than nothing, they definitely aren't necessarily where payers think that they would need to be to make them feel better about the costs that they're putting out for these therapies. So hopefully you can see how pharmacoeconomics can fit into something like value-based contract. It's really important to understand the different approaches like cost benefit, cost effectiveness, cost minimization, cost utility, because those are the types of building blocks that are used to build these value-based contracts. And, you know, as we move forward, there's definitely a push in the whole industry to move away from fee-for-service type arrangements into more value-based arrangements to drive better quality. And you know, pharmacy is no exception. We definitely need to move towards using the most effective drugs and paying for value over volume.